Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we should get started. My name is Lydia Khalil. I am the AVERT coordinator. I'm opening up this session on behalf of our AVERT convener, Michelle Grossman. Her apologies, she is unable to make it, but we really are looking forward to this afternoon's webinar on critical terrorism studies and critical perspectives on countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism. We have Reem Sweid moderating this panel with Professor Richard Jackson and Sondre Lindahl from Norway. We're really looking forward to this discussion. Please feel free to engage with the presenters by putting any questions in the Q&A function as we go along. I will turn it over to Reem shortly to begin this session for us. But as we go along, feel free to put your thoughts in there. And then we will make sure to leave some room for a Q&A at the end. So Reem, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Lydia, and thanks everyone for coming today. I'll just start by saying that in the spirit of reconciliation, Deakin University and the AVERT network acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, to sea, and to their community. And we pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Specifically, I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge that their land was never ceded, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. We only have an hour today, so I'm going to jump straight in to introduce our first speaker, Professor Richard Jackson. Oh, sorry, Richard Jackson is just going to give us an introduction first, and then he's going to introduce our first speaker, which is Associate Professor Sondre Lindahl in Norway, and Professor Jackson is in Dunedin in New Zealand. So Lindahl will talk for 20 minutes after being introduced by Professor Jackson, and then Professor Richard Jackson will give another 20-minute talk, and then we'll open up for Q&A for about 15 minutes. So yeah, put in your questions in the chat and we'll field them at the end. Richard Jackson is a Professor of Peace Studies and the Director of the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago in New Zealand. He's also the editor-in-chief of the journal Critical Studies on Terrorism and is considered one of the founders of the critical terrorism studies field. He's published widely on the terrorism discourse, violence, war, pacifism, and conflict resolution. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you so much, Reem, and thanks also to Lydia for this opportunity to participate in one of these fantastic seminars that AVERT have been putting on. We're very grateful and happy to be part of this. So Sondre and I have been part of the Critical Terrorism Studies group, or the field, subfield, whatever you want to call it, since its inception. And our work focuses on a critical examination of the knowledge, understanding, practices, and consequences at the heart of contemporary counterterrorism, and more broadly, the war on terrorism, and in a way, more recently, the PVE or CVE agenda. Now, we would argue that what we're discussing is much more than simply a simple analytical concept or a discrete program or set of activities. Rather, we would argue that it's a wide-reaching and powerful global discourse, which is constituted by its own specialized terminology, models, and theoretical assumptions, increasingly large bodies of published research, a network of recognized experts, national and international programs, institutions, and actors, huge amounts of investment, and ubiquitous media and political kind of presence and speech. So our critical analysis of this broader discourse is driven by concerns over its very obvious costs and harms, and by the practices of counterterrorism, which since 9/11, but also historically, have included, 1 million or more deaths, mass displacement, mass surveillance, human rights abuses, the rendition and torture programs, Guantanamo Bay, drone killings, as well as things like Islamophobia, the creation of Muslims as a suspect community, harm to community cohesion, racism, and much more. So our analysis suggests that these harms and consequences are not exceptional or simply the result of the poor implementation of counterterrorism or CVE and PVE, but rather they flow out of and are caused by the way in which counterterrorism has been conceived, framed, and practiced. They are the direct result of the kinds of logic, assumptions, approaches, and policies that have been adopted. And we're going to touch on a few of these kind of issues today. So I'd like to hand it over to Sondre, who's going to start with a critical examination of the broader counterterrorism approach. And then hopefully also he'll include some comments about his native country of Norway and how they responded after the Breivik attack. And then following that, I'll give some more specific comments about a kind of critical perspective on counter-radicalization, de-radicalization, CVE, PVE related kind of issues. So I'll hand it over to Sondre.
Thanks, Richard, and good morning from Norway. It's great to talk about critical terrorism studies and the work that's been done on counterterrorism in particular. It's been always been sort of my main area of research from the beginning in AVERT, with always this question of why are we doing the things that we're doing? Are we evaluating the things that we're doing to counter and prevent terrorism? And then are we sort of asking the right questions? And all these things goes into, I think, the CTS scholarship. It is, as is often pointed out, a broad church of research, but I think asking those critical questions are, have always been at the heart of the approach. Some might say, or we all might say, that a big part of CTS has been critique of the so-called orthodox terrorism studies, but also the ongoing practices of especially Western-based or the Western counterterrorism paradigm, perhaps best known as the global war on terror. And I think that that's been sort of the main parts of the critique. And as Richard mentioned, there's a lot to critique here. In many ways, it starts off with the wars, millions of people displaced or killed. We've seen all these illiberal practices. We don't have to run through them all, but looking at the pictures from Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, sort of gives us a clear picture of some of the practices connected to this counterterrorism paradigm. But it's also incurred massive costs. One estimate, recently from research in America suggests that the US has appropriated and is obligated to spend an estimated $6.4 trillion in budgetary cost related to and caused by the global war on terror. So we're talking here of a massive paradigm. We have to add the political chaos in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, and other countries. And so this has been an important part of CTS critique and across many different sort of people with different interests. And it sort of bled into the whole violent extremism discourse and area more recently. But another big part of CTS, which is what I want to focus on because deconstruction is one part of it. There's also reconstruction, which I think has been a part that more work has started to come out now recently in CTS. So what do we want the world to look like, or what do we want counterterrorism to look like if we are dissatisfied with the status quo? If we're dissatisfied with the global war on terror, then what does an alternative look like? A big part of this scholarship has then focused on challenging the illusion of good violence. The use of violence in the global war on terror has been such an important part, and I think is still an important part of critique that we've been looking at. Just this illusion that we can somehow bomb people to become peaceful. If we can just bomb enough, then surely we will make people peaceful or prevent terrorism. I think it was epitomized and sort of put into the bleakest of terms after the attack in Manchester when you saw that picture of the bomb from the RAF, and they put "with love from Manchester" on the bomb that was going to be dropped in some country. And I think that sort of exemplified this relationship to violence. And the problem here is that, as we've argued, is that this force-based counterterrorism is a negatively defined approach in which the goal is to reduce future terrorism by employing greater counter-violence in order to neutralize prospective terrorists. And this might seem logical, you know, at the first instance, but as we argue, and we've tried to show, many CTS scholars have tried to show, is that it's really, it is counterproductive. It is what Joseba Zulaika calls a self-fulfilling prophecy. All this violence basically creates more violence. And then when it's coupled with the taboo on knowledge, which also Zulaika and Douglas have documented, but also Lisa Stampnitsky in her work on disciplining terror and how the field of terrorism came about, also documents the taboo on knowledge, that creating knowledge about terrorism or terrorists or their subjectivity is tabooed and disregarded. So, and this field continues. So, but and this is also what I want to focus on then, is this violence. And then the question is, can we do things differently? Is it possible to imagine things to be different? And then I want to do something very scary, of course, when we're doing seminars. I'm going to share my screen. I think it should be fine. I hope that's, I hope you're seeing what I'm seeing. I'm going to do it one more time just to make sure that we're on the same page here. There we go. I'm going to focus on some part just to try and exemplify some of this work, because when I was doing my PhD with Richard in Dunedin in New Zealand, we were looking at these reconstructive efforts. And one way of looking at it, this could be one of many, but I think it sort of highlights and exemplifies CTS scholarship on the issue of counterterrorism. And this is from an article that I wrote a few years back, and which is in my book, which is called A Critical Theory of Counterterrorism. Within CTS, there was a lot of knowledge about different parts of terrorism studies and terrorism, but also counterterrorism. What I try to do, and I think, again, it exemplifies the CTS approach, is to look at, okay, so if we critique counterterrorism, how can we envision something else? How can we be reconstructive? How can we come up with alternatives? One of the alternatives, I think, is this model, an ideal type model, constructed in a Weberian fashion. But it's looking here, it's highlighting some of the main issues in CTS, that is looking at terrorism as an ontologically unstable fact, needs to be contextualized. And this is connected to the whole discussion of ontological monism and dualism. I'm not going to run through all of it, but I'm going to focus on two of the main parts, which is the basic principles. The first one is the dare to know, which is basically trying to break that taboo on the knowledges, or desubjugating knowledges that's been, and the knowledges that's been ignored in this discourse. Emancipation, very important, also a contentious topic for all scholars who's dealing with critical theory. What does emancipation mean? We don't have to go into that discussion now. That will be the whole seminar, I think, and more than that. But one thing that it leads into, in my model at least, is the means and relationship. And I think this goes for CTS in general, that there is an inviolable connection between the means we use and the changes we want to bring about. And this has been an important part of my research, and but also Richard, and that is being pushed now in CTS, but also in peace studies, is that this non-violent tactics and methods to counter and prevent terrorism, to build up communities to sort of resist extremism, and the recognition from our part, and I'm talking our here in a broad sense, in a Western way, I'm talking about my own country here, Norway, is that the means that we use have to be commensurate with the ends that we want to bring about. So if we want to prevent terrorism, we need to use means that are commensurate with it. And I would like to argue that this massive use of violence that we've been trying to use to counter and prevent terrorism has been not commensurate with those ends. And that's also why the global war on terror keeps going and going and going. Then the final part, I'm just going to scroll down here and we can see what I tried to do here. I hope this is visible for you, because this is what I tried to do both in my doctoral thesis, but that I've been working on as well after that, trying to analyze the Norwegian model of international counterterrorism according to this model. And of course, the model is typical, is an ideal type. It doesn't correspond with anything concrete in the world, but it's a benchmark for analyzing actual counterterrorism. And what I found in my analysis of the Norwegian approach to counterterrorism is that a lot of the things that we're working on in CTS is already present in, or was, I should probably say, already present in the Norwegian approach to counterterrorism. So what happened in Norway is that through the 1990s, they focused a lot on peace diplomacy. Peace diplomacy, as you know, with the Nobel Prize and the Oslo Accord, negotiating in Sri Lanka and Colombia has become a priority for Norway. And one of the elements, an important part of this approach was that Norway never defined terrorism. While other countries did in the 1990s and also after 9/11, Norway never defined terrorism in the same terms because they always looked at it as national conflict or international conflict. And most often, terrorism was seen as a result of national conflict, which meant that the ways to prevent terrorism, to counter terrorism and address it was through peace diplomacy, through negotiations, through political solutions to the problem, not an international problem. I think this was really brought to the fore in 2005 when the LTTE in Sri Lanka was put on the international terror list and also in the EU, and Norway opted out of it because we were in negotiations with the LTTE, a move that was heavily criticized both internationally and in Norway, but they stuck to it. There's also, they put a premium on the UN and human security. Of course, a lot of critical scholars will sort of balk at the notion of human security, perhaps paradigm, but Norway believes very strongly in the United Nations and the human security. But what I found that was most interesting is that without thinking in the discourse on terrorism, the Norwegian approach traditionally contextualized every act of terrorism and usually saw it as a part of national conflict. And that goes for a lot of the terrorist groups that we look at as international and that other people look as impossible to deal with. And the same happened with, to bring it into the most recent conflict, but they did the same with Hamas in Palestine, recognizing that, or their argument at least 15 years ago was that this is a broader political conflict, not defined by terrorism. The terrorism itself isn't the problem, but there's a national conflict. There's a bigger political conflict that requires very different measures and methods to try and counter and prevent future terrorism. The important part for me then, I'm going to leave at that point, is that there is knowledge, there are practices already in place of how to do things differently to try and create a more humane and more emancipatory approach to terrorism or to counterterrorism. And I think the CTS goal in general is to create knowledge and present knowledge that helps us counter and prevent terrorism, but not by using more violence to suppress people and kill people, but try and enable communities around the world to look for better lives, opportunities to create different lives, different futures in where you resist extremism, you resist these terrorist groups, and we enable that instead of just trying to bomb people. So we move from a negatively defined condition of violence to a more positively defined condition. And I think that's the main goal. And I think it's possible to look at things differently. And after 20 years of the war on terror, frankly, we have to start doing things differently if we are serious about countering and preventing international terrorism. I'll stop there and hand it off to Richard, I think.
Great, thanks, Sondre. So I think Sondre has given us a little bit of a taste of the kind of critical terrorism studies critique of counter-terrorism, particularly the war on terror, and a little bit of a taste as well of kind of an alternative conception of counter-terrorism, broadly speaking, that we see partly emerging or evident in the Norwegian context. I'd like to now move on to discuss a little bit more specifically a sort of critical terrorism studies critique of the radicalization, CVE, PVE kind of discourse and set of practices, the whole agenda there, in the understanding that this whole language and set of practices around countering violent extremism and countering radicalization and so on is kind of the contemporary version of counterterrorism in many ways. Or perhaps another way to think about it is the domestic side of the international campaign against terrorism. So I want to raise a few issues, and many of these comments are drawn from a book chapter that I've recently completed on critical approaches to radicalization with one of my other former doctoral students, Kieran Ford, and that's going to be coming out in a book later this year. So first of all, I want to talk about some conceptual or epistemological problems with the whole radicalization, CVE, PVE discourse. And the first central problem is that the term radical is an inherently subjective term, and what is deemed radical is determined largely by the political and historical context in which the term is used. As Beck notes in 2015, what is radical at one time or in one place may not be radical later or elsewhere. So the suffragettes were considered dangerous and radical in their time, as was Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and so on. In some quarters, Black Lives Matter is similarly viewed as radical and violent. If we think about the West's role in providing public, political, and material support to certain groups that would be considered violent extremists today, we could note the Contras in Nicaragua, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and numerous right-wing dictatorships. I mean, recently the United States has provided military support to armed groups in Syria who would certainly have been considered violent extremists earlier in the war on terror. So when we consider that in different contexts, it's possible to speak of radical pacifists, radical anarchists, radical feminists, radical free marketeers, radical Islamists, radical environmentalists, and so on. There's little doubt that, as with the term terrorism itself, as Baker Beale and others put it, it's an essentially contested concept. It's also highly problematic to associate radicalism with violence, as many do, which is something I'll talk a little bit more about. The reality is that in some situation, radicalism is a highly desirable attribute. And so it seems to be really problematic for the discourse when one of its central concepts and assumptions is kind of problematic or suspect from the very beginning. Now, related to this, we would also kind of raise the issue of the indeterminate delineation between moderate and radical. If what the radical might be remains contingent and unclear, what moderate might be fares little better. So this is crucial because the notion of the radical is defined in many ways in terms of its opposition to the moderate. So in virtually all models of radicalization, moderation remains the undefined departure point from which an individual sets out along the path of radicalization. However, despite its centrality to the concept of radical, few attempts have been made to define what the moderate in fact entails. It lacks analytical precision and most often contains contradiction. Most importantly, I think it functions ideologically to legitimize and normalize some forms of violence while delegitimizing others. For example, it serves to obscure the violence from moderate Western states and their allies in regions like the Middle East, or indeed the violence of state police forces in responding to Black Lives Matter movement protests. So once again, a constitutive element of the discourse of radicalization, moderation, can be shown to be vague, indeterminate, contingent, and contradictory in practice. So if it's not possible to define the moderate, how can its opposite, the radical, be defined? And if there is no clear line that distinguishes moderate beliefs, behavior, and violence from radical beliefs, behavior, and violence, then how is it possible to construct a model of the radicalization process? Now, another key issue that this raises is the question of, do radical ideas cause violence? There's an oft-cited definition of radicalization, which comes from Mark Sedgwick, who describes radicalization as what goes on before the bombs go off. So this expresses a widespread assumption within academia and society more widely that radical ideas are causally linked to violent actions. And certainly within the broader radicalization discourse, and particularly within theories and models of radicalization, it's axiomatically assumed that a radical or extreme ideology makes an individual more willing to support or to engage in violence. Yet again, I think that there are reasons to doubt this causal narrative, and when we subject it to scrutiny, it starts to fall apart. At the very least, there's no logical connection between radical ideas and violence, given that radical pacifists, for example, are avowedly non-violent. More importantly, research from terrorism studies casts a great deal of doubt on the purported link between ideology and violence, demonstrating, for example, that ideological commitment in individuals often results from engaging in collective action rather than being a precursor to it, and that individuals join or leave radical movements for a variety of reasons, often unrelated to ideological belief. We might also go into, the differences that people like Borum and Newman have raised about the difference between cognitive radicalization and behavioral radicalization. While some approaches try to link these two concepts very closely, others are a little bit more skeptical about whether or not one determines the other. So Sageman, for example, writes, and I quote, "There's no doubt that ideology, including global neo-jihadi ideology, is an important part of any explanation in the turn to political violence, but we still don't understand how. However, there's simply not enough evidence to suggest that this claim has real credibility, because alongside Kundnani, scholars such as Briggs, for example, have noted, and I quote, "There is no empirical evidence of a causal link between extremism and violent extremism." And Githens, Mazer, and Lambert have noted that prediction of violence on the basis of holding ideas that are by conventional wisdom standards radical, differentiating, or completely contrary to shared values and beliefs is systematically impossible. There is also the problem, I think, that if radicalization is what goes on before the bomb goes off, then the process of military training itself, which conditions soldiers to kill, would also need to be considered a radicalizing process. In the end, as Kundnani puts it, the radicalization literature fails to offer a convincing demonstration of a causal relationship between holding an ideology and choosing to use violence. And this takes us to, the next sort of question that critical terrorism studies scholars raise about this particular discourse and these sort of models and frameworks, is that there's an overemphasis on the role of ideology. So within the broader discourse, the term ideology remains firmly fixed to the signifier extremism. However, it's interesting that it appears that only some groups have ideologies, while other groups are considered to be part of the moderate realm and they instead hold values. So a key concern here is that ideology is offered as the sole or dominant cause of radicalization, to the extent that other relevant factors such as political circumstances, social inequality, historical and present injustices are downplayed or ignored. In the final analysis, we would argue that there's no hard evidence to suggest that ideology impacts on an individual's propensity to use violence in some kind of causally independent manner. So I think that's important, because we're not saying that there's no role, but rather that that role is constituted by and interrelated with a whole series of other important factors. So another key critique here, and I'm kind of rushing through this because there's a lot of critiques, and I know I'm not going to get through them all, is that radicalization is sometimes explained and analyzed and conceptualized through the metaphor of disease or virus. So this is the issue around seeing particularly people as being vulnerable to radicalization. And then that professionals provide assistance in helping individuals gain resilience to radicalization. So in doing so, radicalization is most often depicted as a disease or a virus that can spread through a population. Kassim, for example, describes this as a contagion model. And he says this represents radicalization as an ideological disease or virus to which some individuals are vulnerable, and they catch the disease by contact with infectious agents in the form of radicalizers with extreme ideologies. Again, we would sort of put this metaphor up for scrutiny and argue that it doesn't really hold much water. And in fact, it has a whole series of negative consequences, which we can talk about later. As a kind of little summary of a critique of that is that not only does presenting radicalization within these terms emaciate the agency of individuals in choosing their beliefs, but it also assigns a malicious and unsubstantiated agency to the beliefs or ideas themselves. It kind of gives the impression that beliefs have independent agency to infect people who might be vulnerable to them. So as a little bit of a summary of what I've said thus far, it's important to recognize, I think, the kind of reductionist and misplaced focus and assumptions about ideology and individual agency as the primary source of cause of terrorism and violent extremism. And scholars like Tahir Abbas and Arun Kundnani and many others have pointed out the many suspect assumptions of this particular set of discourses by noting a number of things. For example, the psychological and sociological diversity of militant individuals, as well as their general normality, the non-linear process of individual involvement in violent groups and movements, and the non-ideological reasons why individuals often get involved, why they leave, and so on. The failure to properly distinguish between cognitive and behavioral factors in processes of so-called radicalization, the greater importance of things like relationships between individuals and groups, the effect of radicalized settings in generating so-called radicalized individuals, and questions around the causal power of beliefs, which are changeable, intersubjective, and often contextual. So those are some of the conceptual problems. There's another set of problems, which I've called the practical strategic problems with the discourse. And these relate to things like, and I don't have time to go into this, but the lack of rigorous empirical evaluation of de-radicalization, CVE, PVE, and CT programs or measures. There is very little rigorous empirical research out there evaluating the long-term effectiveness of these kinds of programs. And so a lot of them are based on, kind of assumptions that have not yet been proven. I think more broadly, so-called radicalization indicators it can be argued, have been based so far on some quite poor science. Now, this relates to the fact that the logic of radicalization is often painted as a linear process of various stages, where the aim is to stem the flow of radicalization before it has begun and to halt an individual's radicalization journey. So there exists within radicalization scholarship a desire to get as close as possible to what Kassim refers to as the radicalization process, a sense that there's one unified process that can be understood, and thus obvious indicators that someone has embarked on their journey can be identified. And yet, as Kassim notes, to take a sideways example, it would be ludicrous to suggest that there would be one unified process by which supporters of Arsenal Football Club become Arsenal fans. So he says, and I quote, "Not only is it impossible to know all the relevant environmental factors, it's also impossible to know how the same factors might affect different individuals." And he argues that the desire to find this one unified process outweighs the epistemological and ontological limits that are involved, leaving radicalization scholars with shaky, unscientific tools to work with. And as a consequence, Githens, Mazur, and Lambert, for example, say, and I quote, "Radicalization is a research topic plagued by assumption and intuition, unhappily dominated by conventional wisdom rather than systematic, scientific, and empirically based research." I think I've already touched on this, but there is also here a disproportionate focus on Islam in a lot of these models and sort of broader discourses. And therefore the signs of radicalization that are often picked up are very often indicated through things like increased religiosity. And this is because the broader discourse of violent extremism that's developed since 9/11 strongly associates Islamic practice and beliefs with terrorism. Now, these instances, and there's a lot of research by people like Charlotte Heath Kelly, for example, that have demonstrated how these kinds of signs are used in, for example, prevent programs in the United Kingdom. And these instances have led academics and activists to label counter-radicalization strategies, and the UK's prevent strategy in particular, as being structurally Islamophobic. And again, I don't have time to go into this, but Kassim, for example, notes, and I quote, "There was little talk of radicalization in relation to Irish terrorism in the late 20th century." So clearly the singular focus on Islam is a major problem for the broader radicalization discourse. And yeah, is something that we ought to be cognizant of. Another key issue here is the way in which radicalization indicators often overlap with youth development. I don't have time to go into this, but again, there's a focus on young people, which transforms the universal characteristics of being young into markers of risk and a focus on intervention. So we see a lot of these things, to do with the search for identity, fascination with violence, weapons and uniforms, all kinds of other signs that are often put forward, in fact, are actually quite commonly associated with growing up and being young. So finally, I just want to quickly talk about a number of political ideological consequences of this broader discourse that again are a part of a critique from a critical terrorism studies perspective. So the first one is that if we think about upstreaming into the pre-criminal space that is often involved in the counter-radicalization or the CVE, PVE kind of framework, it can be argued that this threatens democratic pluralism. So today, just to quote, Kunani and Hayes again, today the terms radicalization, extremism, and violent extremism are bandied about with such frequency and abandon that they have become synonymous with terrorism itself, despite their quite different meanings and the lack of clarity as to how these concepts relate to each other. Now, the logical end of a counter-radicalization strategy, which seeks to counter the problem at its earliest stages of extremism, therefore becomes a strategy to produce ideological homogeneity around a hegemonic set of ideas that are designated as moderate. And so this is hardly the ideal of democracy or pluralism, which Western governments are often keen to project. So, and this is an argument that Kieran Ford makes quite strongly in his work. So one of the things that he researched was how in the schools in the UK, examples of instances of extremism were offered to school students that ranged from genocide to handing out leaflets promoting veganism, to environmental activism, to Islamic extremism and so on. And the point is that such a breadth of examples goes some way to illustrate the dangers for democratic pluralism of engaging in a pre-criminal ideological process of countering radicalization conceived as deviance from a prescribed political consensus. So yeah, there's question marks here over the kind of breadth of political opinion that gets squeezed by these kind of interventions. I think in addition to this, we could argue, and it's possible to make the case that the radicalization logic endangers political activism. And we've seen a growing process of which increasingly political activists of various stripes have been painted as extremists, from Black Lives Matter movements to Greenpeace, PETA, and Extinction Rebellion being labeled as extremists. Now, interestingly and importantly, we need to acknowledge as well the breadth of the problems with the radicalization discourse, but the way in which it must be acknowledged that not all individuals caught up in the web of counter-radicalization logics are treated equally, because the discourse is profoundly racialized. So the radicalization discourse and its effects rarely, hardly ever threatens the bodies of white environmental activists in the same way as it does threaten the bodies of Muslims and people of color. And then I want to just briefly finish here. And I think that there are questions, ethical questions about how de-radicalization, PVE, CVE programs actually impact on individual agency, autonomy, and subjectivity. So the way in which, based on the notion that bad thoughts inside people's minds cause bad behavior, and that therefore there is a need to reconstruct or regulate or shape people's thoughts, in many ways it can be argued that these programs are a form of epistemic or ontological violence, right? They are violently trying to change people's sense of themselves and their belief structures and their beliefs. And people like Neil Agarwal have argued that these programs entail a Foucaultian sense of mental discipline and punishment in order to instill kind of self-governance in the subjects. Similarly, Mohammed El-Shimi argues that de-radicalization is best understood as a technology of the self. And he demonstrates that de-radicalization programs involve an interplay between different technologies of the self, discursive, disciplinary, and confessional technologies. The way in which in these programs often, the participants are encouraged to confess the kind of dark thoughts that they've had in order to be, absolved and then hopefully directed in other ways. And from some perspectives, this could be seen as kind of deeply violent. And then my last point is, I think, and hopefully this can be part of a conversation and other people can get into this in a lot more depth, but, a decolonial critique would draw attention to the ways in which the very core terms used in CVE, PVE, and de-radicalization including terms like terrorist, extremist, radicalization, violent, and so on, are all actually inherently racial constructs. And in many ways, we can tell this in part because of the way that they are not typically applied to groups who are part of the white race, as it were. They're not typically applied when we talk about the IRA or ETA and so on. They're also not part of the institutions of white supremacy. We don't talk about white Western state militaries or police forces in these same terms. And we don't talk about, the public who supports humanitarian intervention or war on terror or so on in the same terms. In many ways, it's kind of reflective of the way in which, the origins of the racist or the racial category discourse initially, was conceived on a distinguishment between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And in many ways, this discourse kind of has echoes and reflects these deeper racialized concepts. So I think for all these reasons, there's a critique to be made that focuses on both the scientific basis of these programs, the conceptual basis, which is also dubious, and then the kind of consequences that result from these programs as well. And I've definitely said more than enough, so I'll stop there and open it up to questions, I guess.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Sondre, for really intriguing comments. And I think I'm going to just start straight away by asking one of the questions from the Q&A. And if anyone else has any questions, please pop them into the Q&A box. But someone has asked about whether CTS has kind of critiqued the non-Western countries' use of counterterrorism as a tool to subjugate population or to kind of pursue authoritarian measures. What work has been done in that field?
Okay, I mean, I can just give you a very quick answer to that. There is some great work on that coming out, and there's a book series that I edit with Routledge called the Critical Terrorism Studies book series. And there's a book that's going to be coming out very, very soon. I'm just reviewing the sort of final manuscript of it now, which, for example, is a very powerful critique of Chinese counterterrorism in relation to the Uyghurs. And yeah, it's a brilliant kind of deconstruction of the way in which many of the sort of extreme forms of counterterrorism that we've seen in places like the United Kingdom in relation to prevent have been taken to the absolute nth extreme in relation to the Uyghurs in China. So in relation to surveillance, forms of social control, and forms of, trying to completely reshape the subjectivity, the belief systems, the ideas, the religion, and so on that the Uyghurs have. I mean, there's some exceptional work coming. There's also a great book that's coming on the Egyptian approach to counterterrorism, which has been brutally used to suppress opposition to the state. So I think that there is that work out there for sure.
And we have an article, at least to my knowledge. I'm just, trying to recall what I know here. There's an article in the Critical Studies on Terrorism journal on, again, the lessons from China, the authoritarian regimes against terrorism by Elena Pokalova. I think it's like 2012, 2013, looking at how these, the Chinese government and how that sort of crackdown on the Uyghurs have worked. One of the main knowledges or main findings actually goes to how they use 9/11. Before 9/11, it was seen as a national separatist conflict, and then after 9/11, it was international terrorism. Now we can crack down because there are international terrorists. But there's also been work on Hamas in Palestine, and trying to draw out how they're thinking about their struggles. I'm not saying it's authoritarian regime, but there are work on these different groups. It's not just about Western states. There are more and more research or existing research, and then there are more research coming out just on those sides. But you can find it all in the journal, I think.
Okay, there's no other questions yet that I can see on the chat box, so I'm going to follow up with that and ask, how do you think the response from Western countries who've kind of legitimized this rationale that terrorism is driven by ideology and identity and these things, like, and kind of depoliticized it for their own agenda, are they then able now to criticize other countries, or do you find that there's been that's kind of limited their capacity to really critique China or Egypt on what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I've not studied this specifically, but that makes perfect sense to me that, yeah, it's very hard for Western countries to critique the abuse of counterterrorism in other countries when they're doing the same thing themselves. I mean, yeah, this very difficult for the United States, for example, when they still haven't closed Guantanamo Bay, to still, to be critiquing China's internment camps as well. It kind of shows the hypocrisy here.
Yeah, and I can just add that this has been a concern in Norway. So in Norway's traditional approach to counterterrorism, there was a concern that if we do not use means that are commensurate with our ends, we will be seen as having double standard. And the idea was that Norway can't afford to have the impression that we are dealing with Western double standards. So that was initially a concern. And that was like right after 9/11. And for many years, the Norwegian government stood, they were firm on this position that we can't allow this double standard to exist, because then we can't keep other governments, for example, in China or other countries, accountable. You can't say that, you're breaching human rights and these principles, because we're doing the same. Funnily enough, right after 9/11, Norway was really firm on this position. And then for some reason, lately, this has been starting to be eroded. For some reason, this double standard doesn't occupy us as much anymore. We the current government seems to just given in to the whole global war on terrorism paradigm. But interestingly, I just want to add that this double standard has been a concern in the Norwegian approach to counterterrorism.
Sondre, just to follow up on that, I mean, one of the interesting things is the way in which Anders Breivik was treated. And, people around the world were quite surprised at the way in which he was treated so humanely and given kind of these full rights. And I think that's another example of the way in which you could argue that the Norwegian approach involved, trying to uphold the values rather than give in to that retributive approach.
Yeah,
Okay.
and he was able to sue us, for breaching human rights, right? And he won. Let me just add that he did one-on-one count in the European Court of Human Rights. So yeah.
We have another question from Mark Duckworth about the creation of counter narratives, as they would want to know what your view is on how counter narratives work as part of a CVE program. I was wondering also what you think when you're answering that question, whether you might, and this is my addition to the question, what do you think about how censorship also works as a way to prevent radicalization and the increased kind of collaboration between governments and organizations like Facebook and Twitter and Google? So firstly, Duckworth's question is about counter narratives and their role with that in CVE.
Yeah, look, I think this is, again, slightly problematic, because I don't know that there's any evidence out there, any empirical evidence, that counter narratives actually work. In some ways, this counter narratives idea has a longer genealogy. It comes from counterinsurgency and this whole idea of winning hearts and minds. And now the problem with it is that, first of all, I mean, as I've said, there's no real evidence that what people's beliefs, their narratives that they hold in their minds, is really what motivates or has a direct causal impact on their violent behavior. So whether it has any kind of effect, I think is kind of questionable. The other problem is that I think that in the absence of actually making real reforms and dealing with people's grievances, I don't think counter narratives actually work. So if, for example, the narrative of some extremists are that Western countries keep bombing Middle Eastern countries and then torturing people and rendering them, I don't think you can counter that narrative by saying, no, we don't. I don't think you can counter that narrative by saying, yeah, but we do other good things as well, and we're not all bad. I think the only way you can counter that narrative is by stop bombing countries and stop torturing people. You've got to change policies. So I think counter narratives only really work if they're part of a broader set of reforms. And that relates in a way to this question of censorship and the Christchurch call as well, which I think, there are very, very good reasons to try and restrict extremist content online and harmful content. I think you can, preventing harm is a good thing online. However, I think presenting it as a counter-terrorism package and assuming that it will have a role in preventing further acts of violence in terrorist terms, again, there's no evidence for that. And the problem is that it does rely on a belief that, first of all, as I've mentioned, that ideas are independently agentic and can be infectious. And that if you stop people hearing bad ideas on the internet, they will stop being infected by those ideas, and then they won't act violently. That's such a simplistic kind of model or paradigm, and I'm not sure that there's a great deal of evidence for that. It also assumes that you can deal with all the other factors that go in. I just think historically about this. The internet's only been around, and social media has only been around for a few years, but violent extremism and violent politics has been around for thousands of years. So clearly it's not the internet and it's not social media that is a primary driver or cause. So I don't know that counter narratives or forms of censorship are actually going to be effective. I don't know if Sondre wants to add to that.
Basically just that I I agree with you, Richard. The problem is that I remember this big review or this survey they did, the Pew Research Institute in America in quite a few Middle Eastern countries, and they asked about American values, and there seemed to be an acceptance, or people seem to like so-called Western and American values, but the recurrent question was, why do they have to then ally with these regimes that are doing the exact opposite? Why are they supporting or doing practices that are the opposite of what they're telling us? And I think that's the problem. The problem again here, the means have to be commensurate with the ends, and how many narratives you put out that we're not doing whatever we're doing, I think is really counterproductive. So we need to, in a true liberal fashion, we need to hold ourselves accountable, because the way that CVE counter-terrorism, the paradigm, but also now the counter-radicalization, to me, it seems to move into the way of what John Stuart Mill would call a dead dogma. We're not allowed to critique it. It just held up there as some sort of truth or the way we're doing things. And this is the truly sad part for me. I count myself as a liberal, but my God, it is hard to perform liberal critiques of liberal regimes.
I think
you're struck with very illiberal critique or censorship immediately.
That's a great place to end. I think it kind of succinctly put it there. A lot of us liberals find ourselves in this kind of situation where it's difficult to critique what's going on without being painted as, either radical yourself or also in the same basket sometimes with far right extremists and things like that you see, and you can say no, but it's not about that. It's about these liberal values. I just want to thank you both so much for your time today, and it was really, really insightful. I'll send it back to Lydia now.
Well, thank you all. Thank you so much, Reem, for putting forward this idea for this webinar. We really thank both of the panelists for their insightful comments, and we really welcome having this discussion on critical perspectives, which you've all pointed out is not something that is usually part of our discussions when it comes to countering terrorism and countering violent extremism, or it's done perhaps in a more fragmented fashion. So it's nice to have that cohesive a dialogue and broad introduction of the issues. So really sincerely thank you all for putting this together and presenting and being part of the AVERT webinar program. I'll just close by saying to our members here that this webinar will be recorded, it'll be online, and we'll send links around, which please feel free to forward to your networks in case anyone didn't have a chance to attend live the webinar, and also to look out for an invitation of our upcoming webinar in June. And this one we're doing jointly with the Canadian Research Network TSAS, and it will be on religion and the far right. We're exploring the religious aspects of far right extremism. So with that, thank you once again. Good night to everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you all on the next AVERT webinar.
Great, thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.